Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Watson Institute, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rick Locke. I currently serve, I think, for another 2 weeks as the director of the Watson Institute and also as the provost of Brown University. And it's my great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Ambassador Christopher Hill. Let me begin by noting that we're welcoming Ambassador Hill back to Rhode Island. He just told me an anecdote that he actually bumped into his high school history teacher on the street, as he has spent many of his formative years here on the east side of Providence, first at the Moses Brown School, and he still maintains a home in Little Compton. Ambassador Hill received his master's degree from the Naval War College, with which the Watson Institute has a very close partnership in addressing contemporary security challenges. And just today, I think that probably several of you in this room might have participated in the Naval War College Watson Faculty Colloquium on security issues in South Asia. Ambassador Hill is the Dean of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, a position that he has held since September 2010. He has authored a terrific memoir, Outpost, Life on the Frontlines of American Diplomacy, which is listed by Foreign Policy Association as one of the 10 most important books in 2014. A former career diplomat, Ambassador Hill has served as ambassador to Iraq, the Republic of Korea, Poland, the Republic of Macedonia, as well as Special Envoy to Kosovo. And he was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 to 2009, during which he headed the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue. Earlier, he served as a special assistant to the president and senior director on the staff of the National Security Council and on the State Department's policy planning staff, as well as a staff member for Congressman Stephen Solars. With tours in Belgrade, Warsaw, and Tirana, Ambassador Hill developed a particular expertise in Eastern Europe and became a member of the U.S. negotiating team in the Bosnia-Herzegovina peace settlement, which was led by a former Brown graduate and Watson professor, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. In his memoir of the peace process to end a war, Richard Holbrooke called Chris Hill brilliant, fearless, and argumentative, and that's quote unquote, I'm not adding that last word, and emphasized his substantial... It might be hard for you to make that argument right now. And emphasized his substantial role in negotiating key components of the peace settlement with Serbian President Milosevic. It is therefore fitting that Ambassador Hill should deliver the keynote address kicking off the Watson Institute workshop, Dayton at 20, an impact assessment. As everyone, I think, in this room knows, the Dayton Peace Accords were initialed on November 21st and signed on December 14th, 1995, 20 years ago. And such milestones offer true opportunities for us to review accomplishments, but also to take stock of previous policies. And there can be no doubt that the Dayton Accord, in the past several decades, in halting both the largest conflict in Europe since World War II and ethnic cleansing, which resulted in more than 200,000 deaths, is one of those very important moments in recent history. And so it's really an important time to take stock of that moment. And we are very fortunate to have Ambassador Hill to kick us off in those reflections. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Christopher Hill.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and for raising my tribal loyalties here in Rhode Island. You know, one time I was in Albania and an American ship, a naval ship, came by and they served some wine, and it turned out to be Little Compton wine. So I was able to, actually it's not bad wine, but I was able to give some of my Albanian friends a taste of their own medicine in insisting that they drink my village wine. So it's quite daunting to come back here to Rhode Island, a a state that is fairly small. First of all, I just meet so many people I know. Ambassador Richard Boucher there, sitting in the front row. Richard did many things in his career, including being assistant secretary and ambassador, but he was also one of the, at a couple of times, State Department spokesperson. And so for those of you who wonder how does the spokesperson know what to say in the morning or at the noon press briefing, he gets various guidances from offices all over the building, and so you'd come down and he'd look at some guidance and he couldn't understand. He said, "I can't say this," and you say, "You have to say this. We've cleared it all the way up." He said, "Okay, I'll try to say this, but it doesn't make any sense." And we'd always point out that's not necessarily the object of the exercise. It's just to get through this. So I think Richard would agree with me that one of the truly, it's a great honor really to represent this country abroad, to have the opportunity to really explain what it is we're trying to do. There are days when that's harder to do than other days. I would not want to be out there explaining what is going on in the American political campaign today. But on the other hand, I think it's important to try to reassure people that, yes, we do go through a protracted period that is often far longer than any other country has to go through. But at the end, even though we sometimes do without a foreign policy for upwards of a year, we nonetheless come back and understand the responsibilities that we have in the world, and I think this time will be no exception. You know, when I look back at the Dayton Peace Accords, it seems like somehow compared to what is going on today, compared to the difficulties today, it seems like a sort of Boy Scout camp. It just doesn't seem quite to be the sort of searing, I mean, just gut-wrenching issues that we're seeing today. But again, I would be very careful of presentism in evaluating things that happened 20 years ago, because in fact it was a very, very difficult period. And frankly, it was a period where there was so much at stake. And yet, the United States, you know, we were sort of called to be very much involved in the leadership of trying to resolve a war that had gone on for several years, some 4 years. And it was a war that we weren't really sure how to end, but we were sure had to be ended. That is, when you have upwards of 230,000 people killed in a war, the first thing you have to do is stop the fighting. And so much of what we did was aimed precisely at the issue of how to stop the fighting. And so in the fullness of time, in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of people look at this and they ask, why did you do this? Why did you negotiate these elements? And above all, why did you make the structures of Bosnia so complex such that today there are many people who say no state, certainly not Bosnia, can exist with these complex structures. After all, we had a parliament in first of all, we made a federation between the Muslims, now referred to as Bosniaks, the Muslims and the Croats, when we made this a federation. And that went into sort of immediate marriage counseling, so we appointed a special arbitrator named Robert Zoen, who addressed these just myriad of issues every day about how these various government structures were going to look at in this Croat Bosniak federation. And so as we're getting ready for Dayton, we had to make sure that they had a parliament, but on the Serb entity, they wanted a parliament, but we didn't just want a parliament in the Serb entity and the parliament in the federation entity. We wanted a third parliament, which would be the real parliament for the country. So you end up with 3 parliaments. And so today people kind of laugh at that and wonder, how it was that we came up with 3 parliaments. And the answer was you tried to get people to say, we'll go with 1, and failing that, you go with 2, and failing that, you end up with 3. It was a painful, painstaking process. When people look at Dayton today, it's really looked at often from a political science perspective. You know, why did you do that? Why did you set up the Constitution like this? Why didn't you set it up like that? But, and I'm looking over at my high school history professor, David Ransom, because, and David, I'm not just saying this because you're here, but I think every problem you need to first start with the history. And because if you don't have the history, and I mean real history, I'm not talking constructivism and all that stuff, I'm talking real history. And you've got to know where these people have come and where they expect to go. And you're also not going to get them to stop killing each other unless you first get them to understand that you understand how this all happened and why you have to kind of slice the loaf in the way you did. So as Bosnia raged on, it was not something in a vacuum. It was something very much that was affecting other interests. One of the chief issues, of course, was not just the future of Bosnia, but it was frankly the future of Europe, and I would say the future of the North Atlantic relationship. You know, problems. Many people went and looked at Bosnia. Why were they so obsessed with this tiny little place? Why weren't they working with the sort of central elements of what was going on in this immediate post-war period? And I think, first of all, history teaches us that often nasty problems happen on the scruffy edges of things. And those nasty problems on the scruffy edges eventually can infect and can really create whole new problems in the center of things. And so, in addition to the fact that we had now what we wanted in life, which was a Europe whole and free and at peace, we also had a Europe that was clearly not at peace and a Europe that was beginning to break apart. We didn't really, the Soviet Union had really been a kind of glue to hold us all together. I mean, certainly the U.S. had different approaches to things than some of the European allies, but we always managed to say at the end of the day, we need to stick together because this is the way to deal with the Soviet Union. And so problems that we had, we managed to patch them up with the understanding that the Soviet Union was what we needed to be concerned about. So in the post-Cold War era, we had a kind of new world disorder. We had a great deal. We had Americans kind of going in their own direction. We had Europeans going in their own directions. You know, the quest for a European identity in the 1990s, a quest which, by the way, is still sort of out there without being resolved. But that quest for a European identity was not being forged on the basis that somehow it's separate from Russia. In fact, there was a desire to bring Russia into this European identity. So the identity was being created on a sort of self and other basis, and the other was the United States. So we were seeing time and time again Europeans describing how they are together, and they are not just like Americans. After all, Americans, we were interested in the United States didn't understand the importance of Kyoto. We didn't understand, we were somehow pro-death penalty while the Europeans were opposed to the death penalty. I mean, all these kinds of issues were kind of raised by European politicians to say we're not just another flavor of Americans. We're very different from the Americans. We have a different approach to the Americans. So when you come to a situation like Kosovo or like Bosnia, you realize that we were coming at these problems from very different perspectives. The Europeans still very much focused on no more war. We cannot have more conflict on our continent. They knew what had happened in conflict. And yet you had Americans saying, how can you be contributing troops to that UN, that feckless UN organization known as UNPROFOR? How could you be contributing troops to that and in so doing, ignoring the human rights violations that were clearly happening every day? So we found that some of these values issues, including human rights, were really being put to the test as we went forward in Bosnia. And so all these issues that were kind of kept under wraps during the Cold War had really kind of emerged in full force in the 1990s and were there to divide us as we dealt with Bosnia. We understood, the United States understood, that even though we didn't want, even though we had a different perspective than the Europeans, we understood a couple of things. One, human rights and these kind of values issues, values agendas, they were here to stay. And so anything we did had to incorporate those concepts of values. But we understood a second thing, which was we didn't know how long this kind of peace dividend, that is this time of Europe not being threatened with war, we didn't know how long it would go on. And so we understood the absolute necessity of staying close to the Europeans. So with these two goals in mind, trying to manage things with our allies, the Europeans, trying to make sure that NATO and other institutions that we had built through the Cold War remained for future use, and I would argue there are a lot of good reasons for NATO today. And at the same time, understanding how to manage some of these values. After all, when you look at American foreign policy, I mean, we had our foreign policy in the 1830s was entirely values laden. It was missionaries, it was American way of life, and it was interrupted by this miserable century of the 20th century of two world wars and then a Cold War, which kind of forced us all to be very focused on the threat out there. But some of this stuff was really back in the 1990s. So we went into Bosnia understanding that just being so critical of the Europeans, standing in a place like Washington and issuing these blood-curdling statements about the fecklessness of the Europeans was not really a place where we needed to be. In fact, we needed to do a much better job of it. So we tried various approaches. We had various senior former politicians getting involved. We had Jimmy Carter. And we didn't want to deal with Karadzic. And I'm going to get back to that subject because I think it has a present-day resonance. We didn't want to deal with Karadzic, and we said we're not going to deal with someone who's clearly a war criminal. But Jimmy Carter didn't mind dealing with Karadzic, so he went to Pale, which was the former ski resort, now Bosnian Serb capital, and worked with the Bosnian Serbs and kind of criticized his successor, that is Bill Clinton, for not dealing with all the Serbs there. So not an easy situation for us, but what we finally decided to do was we needed to work with the Europeans and work very directly with them and be strong participants in what became known as the contact group. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, and various other elements of the European Union that eventually dwarfed the number of countries involved in it, just as the G8 became the G108 by the time you got through with all the European Union elements. So we started to work within this contact group, and we came up with something called the Contact Group Plan. Now, the context of the Contact Group Plan, which was 1994, over 21 years ago, the context of that plan was that the Serbs at the time had about 70% of the area of Bosnia. I remember we had these maps which the CIA would print out every week, and for some reason the Bosnian Federation areas were in yellow, the Serb areas were in a sort of light pink. And I remember Warren Christopher would look at these things Secretary Christopher would look at these things every week and say, there's a lot of pink on that map today. And in fact, I mean, we were losing territory. We're losing territory all the time to the Serbs. So we knew we needed some kind of military approach, and I'll get to that in a second. But what we really needed was a contact group plan that everyone would agree on, and that even if there was more pink on that map the next day, the federation, that is the Bosnian Croat Federation, would have 51% of the territory, and the Serbs would have 49%. Well, the Serbs said this is ridiculous. You can't expect people who have 70+% of the map to have only 49%. but the Brits, the French, the Germans, the Americans, the Russians, we all agreed that's what it's going to look like. A big accomplishment in the spring of 1994. Then we laid out some principles about what Bosnia was going to look like. Should it be within its existing borders? You know, there were a lot of people, including Croatian President Tudjman, and the Serb President Milosevic, who had done up a map and decided all the Croat areas should just go to Croatia, and all the Bosnian Serb areas should go to Serbia. And maybe you could leave this little rump state in the middle for the Bosniaks, the Muslims. So it wasn't such an easy deal to say it's going to be within its international borders, and we did it. We had concepts of democracy, kind of very vague concepts, but this was going to be the contact group plan. Well, in the succeeding year, we tried to shop the plan to the parties. The Bosnian Serbs were not interested. The Bosniaks were interested, and even though many of them considered this really a travesty that there should be this area reserved for the Serbs, but they are interested enough such that those who rejected it, that is the Bosnian Serbs, we called them rejectionists. And those who accepted it, we called them participants to the process, that is moderates. Now, you notice the difference. I'll just interject for a second. In Syria, we've declared that there are certain people who are moderates and certain people who are not. And it's really unclear how we get to that because there's no such plan at this point. So I'm not sure whether we administer some kind of questionnaire. What best describes you, A, moderate, B, very moderate, et cetera. We have no idea who's a moderate in Syria. In Bosnia, we had a very clear idea. You accept the contact group plan, you're a moderate. You reject it, you're a rejectionist. And so to go through that kind of painful year, meanwhile, there was, we were beginning to see the fruits of our efforts to work with the Muslims and the Croats that resulted in a lot more connectivity in their militaries. So we found that the Bosnians started making progress on the battlefield. It started, there were a number of areas where they were making progress. One of the areas was the Livno Valley. Why the Livno Valley? Well, when you look at a map, you can see part of Croatia just behind it, which was called Krajina, and you knew the Croats were going to launch an invasion or to take back Serb areas of Croatia. And so they wanted it sealed from the back to make sure the Serbs weren't able to flow in forces. So they're very interested in this Livno Valley operation. Ugly stuff. We knew what was going on, and we knew that it was not going to be a very nice war once the Croats attacked there, but we went along with it. So we supported that. But we kept in mind what the goals of the contact group plan were. By the summer of 1995, we had this hideous Srebrenica massacre, and Srebrenica is one of the great war crimes of the war. There were some. It took place in this area called Srebrenica, which is one of the Muslim enclaves in the main part of where mainly the Serbs were. That is in eastern Serbia. In this Muslim enclave of Srebrenica, there were some local militia who fought against the Serbs. At one point, they achieved a kind of tactical victory, and they'd pushed the Serbs back and captured some of their equipment. And at that point, the Bosnian Serbs said, we've had enough from this local militia in Srebrenica, and they went and collapsed the whole pocket, took it all down, and then the Muslim fighters were left to run to the main Federation area through the forest, and the Serbs hunted them down and killed them. So at that point, with the Bosnian Serbs being the rejectionists and having committed still another war crime, we took off after them with a much more robust NATO air campaign. And I say more robust because up until then, the European Union forces that comprise most of the UNPROFOR would have to request of their UN commanders an airstrike, at which point the UN commanders would think about it and then ask NATO to do it. It was a so-called dual key. This time, that process was greatly streamlined, and we started hitting them very hard. So in the meantime, though, with the Bosnian Serbs being hit hard, and they were able to take some of Srebrenica, but they were not able to take the other main enclave, which is Gorazde. We then, together with the Europeans, launched another peace offensive. And this came with my mentor and my tormentor, Richard Holbrooke, and Brown graduate. And so Holbrooke had studied this issue for years, and he was raring to go. And I remember Strobe Talbot said to me at one point, "I think it's time to unleash our thermonuclear weapon," referring to Holbrooke. And what happened was Holbrooke started shopping the contact group plan and developing the contact group plan. And first of all, we got Milosevic to agree to speak for all the Serbs. Now, the Milosevic would always say, "I can't speak for those crazy people. I have nothing to do with those crazy people. Don't ask me to speak for those crazy people." We said, "You've got to speak for those crazy people," and there are some obvious reasons why, but we needed from Holbrooke his willingness to take on the tough decisions that were going to be made for the Serbs. And so we needed from him some proof that he really could speak for them, because he had been saying he couldn't, and then he said, "Okay, I'm going to try." And so what he produced for us one night this is in September 1995, he produced a letter from the patriarch of the leader of the Serb church, to whom the Bosnian Serbs and the Serbs in Serbia were believers. So he had a letter from the patriarch authorizing him, Holbrooke, the right. I always get Milosevic and Holbrooke mixed up. Authorizing Milosevic the right to speak for all Serbs. So then there were still air operations going on. There had been some other breakdowns, and we were continuing to push with air operations, but also diplomatically. We put together a list of agreed, it was called Agreed Principles. It was about one page, and it was to show really how the contact group plan would be implemented. Everything after the contact group plan of 1994, you have to understand as an implementation plan, and that was certainly the case when we finally got to Dayton. So we put together something called Agreed Principles, which showed how Bosnia would be divided, and then something called Further Agreed Principles. We had three main agreed principles, and then a week later we negotiated a document called Further Agreed Principles. It started with the number 4, just to show that it definitely went together, not just because it was stapled, but also because it was the same document. And those Further Agreed Principles showed how Bosnia would be united. Meanwhile, the Bosnians were making much more progress on the ground, because Milosevic had essentially told the Bosnian Serbs, "Enough, we're going to negotiate on the basis of the contact group plan. We're not going to try to get more territory. This war is over, guys." But as has been the case since the Peloponnesian Wars, I think anyone in the Naval War College knows about the Peloponnesian Wars, it's hard to get both sides to terminate to end the war, or to want to end the war at the same time. So now we were faced with the fact that the Bosnian Serbs wanted to end the war, but the Bosnians didn't want to end the war because they wanted to move on. Now, there are those who say that why did we end it when the Bosnian Serbs were actually on the offensive? But the whole agreement that we had with the Europeans, we had with the Russians, was an agreement based on the contact group plan, and we felt we were in striking distance. The Serbs no longer had 75%, they had more like 55%. So we felt we could move ahead with this. So we put together agreed principles, we put together further agreed principles to show how this state would work, and then we announced the final implementation measure, which would be the Dayton Peace Accords. That is, we agreed to go to Dayton, and there are a lot of reasons why we went to Dayton, but most of them are fairly prosaic, like how much we were going to be charged per person per night. And we agreed we'd do that, but finally, after agreeing to all this, there was one more thing we wanted to do. And what was that? That was to have a ceasefire. And so the concern was, now a lot of people say, well, didn't you have that upside down? Why would you have the ceasefire last? Isn't that the first thing you do? There had been so many failed ceasefires. They were approaching the record held for failed ceasefires in Beirut. So the decision was, we're not going to go for a ceasefire until there's a reason to stop firing your weapon. Because nobody wants to be the last person to die in a civil war. So once you have it set up that you know what the future is going to be, you don't want to die for something that's already been decided. So once we had an agreement we were going to go to Dayton, everyone kind of knew this was it, and they didn't want to fight at that point, and we declared a ceasefire, and it is held to this day. So in Dayton, it was not a lot of fun. Holbrooke tried to ban the use of the cell phone, except for himself. We had literally we would confiscate cell phones because people would try to negotiate through the press. So you'd have a tough time with the Bosnians that day, and lo and behold, the New York Times would have a story about how you gave a tough time to the Bosnians that day. So we tried to limit that kind of stuff. It was not easy because, and that part has never changed, people don't like to give up their cell phones. But we were eventually able to put together an agreement which gave Bosnia a new constitution, which gave it certain accoutrements of a modern state, and especially the issue of human rights monitoring, the right of the return of refugees from where there were displaced people from where they had been kicked out. We put all this together with the fundamental understanding that for Bosnia to work, you would need a consensus position on it to work. You couldn't simply jam the other guy to get it done. And so to this, as we look back at Dayton today, people say, well, why are these structures so complex? And the answer is because the Bosnians, the Croats, and the Serbs wanted them to be complex. There are those who point out that this system it cannot work for Bosnia. But to those people, especially the Bosniaks who say that, we would never want to go back to a system where you have to jam the other guy and jam him with military force. So we said, you're going to have to convince the other guy that your position is correct. Obviously Bosnia is not a strong state, and the Bosnians who have kind of, anyone who knows Balkan habits knows that first you blame the Ottoman Empire, and when you get tired of blaming the Ottoman Empire, you move over to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then finally, when that gets a little old, you blame the Americans in Dayton, Ohio. And so we're in that phase today. And I think we need to be pretty tough with people that if you want to get that changed, if you don't like how this is being, how this is working out, you are going to have to be able to go to the Serbs or go to the Bosnians and make your case, cut some deal, do what you need to do, and get it changed. So that's kind of where we are. But there are a couple of other elements of that agreement I'd like to mention, which was that toward the end of Dayton, Holbrooke asked me to go over to see Milosevic one night. And we went over to his suite. It was always a little confusing because his suite was identical to the Bosnian suite, and which was also identical to the Croat suite. We didn't want to have anyone complain that he had a bigger table than the other, et cetera. So we walk in, and of course it was Milosevic was sitting there. And we told Milosevic, okay, we have an agreement on an inter-entity boundary line. We have basically an agreement on the map. In fact, there was more follies to come because when the map guys studied the map, we realized we had the Bosnian Serbs down to 46, not 49, so we had to give them some territory back. And if you ever look at an internal map of Bosnia, under the Highway 5 near Mrkonjić, you'll see a funny little egg-shaped thing that's for the Serbs, and you'll wonder, why is that? I mean, there's no one living there or anything. That was to get back to 49%. So we basically had an agreement on a map. We had an agreement on a constitution. We had tried to come up with some central district for Sarajevo, but ultimately we just had to jam Milosevic on that, and he agreed that Sarajevo, including the Grbovica, which was a major Serb suburb, would be for the Bosnian Muslims. So we had a unified Sarajevo. We were not going to, after only a few years of a unified Berlin, we're not going to create another divided city in Europe. So we had the map, we had the constitution, we had the agreement on Sarajevo, and we had an election schedule, we had an agreement on a security force, we had an agreement on election monitors, and then we said, Mr. President, there's one more thing. Radovan Karadzic and his ilk cannot be part of the future of Bosnia. So Milosevic looked at us and said, you know, how can you do this? This is up to the people to decide. That's why we have elections. Why are you saying that these people, I know you think they're war criminals, but you know, there's no way Milosevic can ban them from the political process. And we said, well, we've done a lot here, and this is a demand we're going to hold to. Milosevic looked back at the table, saw the Constitution, saw the map, saw the election schedule, the security forces, and he changed the subject. I mention that because today we have a similar circumstance in Syria, except rather than get the deal 90% done and say, oh, by the way, we don't think Assad should be part of this deal, we've essentially put it upside down and first said that Assad must go, and then said that we're somehow going to put together some kind of new Syrian state. And lo and behold, Assad, the Iranians, others have simply not accepted this proposition. I would argue that if we learn some of the lessons of Dayton, we might consider the lesson to try to talk to as many people, get as many people in the room, hammer through a deal, get the deal, and then if you really want to say that that we should exclude Assad rather than the Syrian people, and I think there are a lot of good reasons for excluding Assad, starting with the fact that in my view he's a war criminal and will be judged as such. But after you've gotten all the deal sort of clear to people, I think that's the time to say certain personalities should not be involved. I think that would be a much more doable proposition than what we're doing today, which is to get stuck for 4.5 long years on whether Assad should be part of the Syria's future. I think we also made very clear that when we were dropping ordnance on people, bombing, we were also bombing in respect of a deal. If you support the contact group plan, you're with us. If you don't, you're a rejectionist and we'll whack you. Ugly stuff. And by the way, anyone who thinks dropping bombs is some kind of antiseptic business, it ain't. And so, but we did it in support of a political arrangement. Today in Syria, what is the political arrangement on the basis of which we're bombing people? We don't really, are we bombing people to deplete the number of people there and then hope that there'll be more good guys to come forward? How can you use military force without a political arrangement? And yet that lesson of Dayton and of the entire contact group plan in Dayton has been misunderstood and frankly ignored. We also did something in Dayton. I mentioned earlier our work with the Europeans. We understood that we needed to make sure that we came out of this process with a stronger relationship between the U.S. and Europe. And so have we really looked at others who have some equities in this issue in Syria? We knew that the Europeans had some very strong feelings about how Bosnia should be handled. We knew the Russians had strong feelings. We worked with them. We engaged them so that we were able to come up with an agreement, and that's why we ended up with 51-49. I mean, we would have, if it were up to the U.S., maybe we would have said the whole thing should be a Bosniak unitary state, and we will support getting rid of the Serbs and expelling them to Serbia. Well, we didn't do that because there was no support for that, and we worked through the Europeans and the Russians, and we came up with this plan, and we kept this support together through the entire conflict. And I mention that because I think it is in sharp contrast today, where there was no concept that maybe the Iranians, maybe the Russians, maybe others would have a kind of different view of what Syria should be. So, and I think another point that is kind of lost as we approach, I think tomorrow will be the first day of this next round of Syrian talks. We understood that the first rule of democracy is indeed elections. I mean, you cannot have a democracy without elections. I mean, the Singaporeans would try to claim you could do that, but even they are having real elections these days. So you need elections in a democracy. That's lesson one of democracy. But lesson two, which really should be stapled to lesson one, is that you have to respect the interests of the minorities. So if your entire peace plan with Syria consists of an election, all you will do is validate the majority, and you will leave the minorities, of whom there are many in Syria, feeling very worried, feeling very exposed. So we understood that the whole origin of the Bosnian crisis was that we had a 34%, the percentages have changed over the years, we had a 44% Bosnian Muslim plurality, 44%. We had a Serb entity of 34%, that's a lot of people. And then Croats were 20, and then there were others. In Syria, we have a country that's 60% Sunni. And 60% will carry the majority. They will. I mean, the Sunnis don't agree on too much, but they will all vote for Sunnis. And I know this from Iraq. They will all vote for Sunnis, and the Alawites will all vote for Alawites. The Christians will vote for the Christians, the Druze will vote for the Druze, and the Kurds will vote for the Kurds. So an election, in the absence of democratic structures and in the absence of safeguards for the minorities, an election is simply a referendum, it's simply a census. And so having that kind of census is not going to make your minorities feel that they're going to be protected. They need to believe that the structure of the country as it emerges will protect them. Now, people look at Bosnia today and say, didn't you go a little far making Banja Luka the capital of this Bosnian Serb entity and allowing them to have these local elections? That is what was necessary to have the Serbs of Bosnia believe that they would be protected in a political and even security sense. And yet, no one has thought about that in Syria as we go forward with having elections. Because elections are only one element of democracy, and we should not conflate the complexity of democracy with the simplicity of elections. So, to me, what is difficult for me to think back about Dayton is the fact that there were lessons learned, but they have lessons that somehow have not been understood or have, worse yet, been forgotten in the fullness of these 20 years. And so to this day, I don't think people understand why we did these things and why some of these things might be applicable to the problems we face today. For all the people who think that Bosnia was some kind of a misadventure, that we somehow did not understand, that we needed to simply sign on to the proposition that the good guys were going to prevail. It is extraordinary to me, for example, to read in The Guardian the analysis that said there was an alternative to the Dayton. By the autumn of 1995, the tables had been turned on the Bosnian War, NATO was bombing Serb positions. This is a journalist with the Guardian newspaper. That the NATO was bombing Serb positions. The Croat army was advancing from the west in coordination with the Bosnian army and Bosnian Croat militias. If that offensive had continued, Serbs' only significant town, Banja Luka, would have fallen, as would have Karadzic's regime. The defeat, combined with a fresh influx of Serb refugees from Bosnia, would have weakened Milosevic's hold on power in Belgrade. If he had been ousted then, the 1999 war in Kosovo would never have happened. Well, this is an otherwise peace-loving person, a very kind of right-minded writer. I'll get his name. I'm sorry, I didn't write it here. But he's of the view that we should have kept attacking the Bosnian Serbs. And amazingly enough, he supports the idea that in attacking them and taking Banja Luka, we could have used the refugees that would stream out of Banja Luka to somehow destabilize Milosevic's regime in Serbia. And so to those people who think that war is really an answer in these circumstances, I would like, at least he understands one thing, that show me a war and I'll show you refugees. And so, but in his case, he feels that's an advantage, and he's going to use refugees as a kind of weapon in and of themselves. So I think we need to learn some of the lessons of this peace process at Dayton, and learn the fact that through, I think, creative diplomacy and diplomacy that would really not quit, we were able to make some real progress. And to this day, Bosnia, for all of its problems and for all of its difficulties, nobody's killing each other there anymore. So thank you very much, and go to some questions.
We have time for questions then?
So you want me to call on people? Yes, sir.
Can I just ask you to use the mic?
Sure. Thank you for explaining to a lot of people just what democracy is. Because if you had the right answer in 20 years ago, no one seems to have remembered that ever since.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Iraq, where you were.
Yeah.
Shiites were elected when the Sunnis were
Yeah.
the party that had all the power and all the positions and all the know-how. They had an election in Egypt that lasted for a short time, a democratic election. I think that most of us don't understand that democracy is not having everybody vote and the answer, and they supply the answer to the problem. That didn't happen in this country.
Yeah.
We keep on forgetting that. So thank you very much for a wonderful lecture on a place that we don't think about too often anymore.
Which is a good thing, by the way.
But
Yeah.
you all did a great job, and thanks for helping Holbrook to do the job that he did.
I miss him every day, I got to tell you. There were so many of these memorial services for him. I just couldn't stand it. I couldn't even go. I was so upset, And I think what really bothered me is I don't think he was well treated in his last role in Afghanistan, Pakistan. A lot of people had kind of forgotten the need to try to cut these deals, and the need sometimes to deal with bad guys. I mean, if I could do it, I'd love to just deal with Red Sox fans and we'd be fine. But not everyone's a Red Sox fan, and I think we need to be prepared to deal with these people. And the second issue, as you allude to, is this issue of elections. If the political identity is wrapped up in your sectarian identity, that is, if you are, I would like people to have a political identity, I don't know, big government, small government, because you could change your mind overnight. And no, actually, I want small government now. I mean, that identity can shift, but when political identity is based on your ethnicity or your sectarian identity, then it becomes a tougher proposition, and then you have to be very mindful of who the minorities are and how those minorities are going to feel when you have a system in which the majority will win if the elections are more or less fair. So you're absolutely right. In Iraq, we had, in Syria, you have 60% Sunnis. In Iraq, there were 60% Arab Shia. And so they would say, we want democracy. And what they meant was that they would have the Shia would win. And they did win. And they had more people in the parliament. They were able to form the government. But that's not enough unless you have institutions that will make the Sunnis feel part of the future. You know, Nelson Mandela did a brilliant job of saying, white South Africans, I know you're a 20% proposition, which is what the Sunni Arabs are in Iraq, but white South Africans, we want you as part of the future of South Africa. Stay and be part of us. You know, it hasn't been perfect, but that kind of attitude really helped them through. But Nelson Mandela was not an Iraqi. And I never met an Iraqi who reminded me of Nelson Mandela. I mean, I worked with this Prime Minister Maliki all through his life. He had been tormented by the Sunnis all through his father's life, his grandfather's life. I mean, they hated the Sunnis because they were tormented for years and years. And he would say, how can you ask me to do something like that? And besides, you know, whereas Nelson Mandela could really get stuff done because of his, you know, unbelievable personality. I mean, Nouri al-Maliki, if he ever had charisma, it cleared up a long time ago. It was very difficult. So you're going to have to rely on creating strong institutions.
Well, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. I was struck by something you said early on about real history, which I think is really refreshing to hear because I think a lot of, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
In policy, oftentimes this is forgotten how deep these histories are. And I know
Yeah.
you talked primarily about the Cold War history and American versus European history, but also I'm curious about this comment of real history of the region. And it seems to me that the way that the peace agreement was carved and crafted and envisioned and delivered doesn't encompass necessarily interconnected histories. It doesn't envision
Overlapping histories.
overlapping hybrid identities.
Yeah.
It assumes that they're ethnically conceived people living in ethnically conceived territories, which doesn't match Bosnian history.
Right.
So I'm wondering how in the peace agreement itself how it could be made maybe more flexible to recognize a necessity of recognizing that kind of history.
Yeah.
Because I know you say, okay, Bosnians are not killing each other today, but many of them feel stuck in these ethnic boxes. You
Yeah.
probably hear that a lot. And there is a lot of discouragement to create inter-ethnic politics,
Yeah.
really. Political system doesn't even allow you to do so because the only way you exist is as an ethnic citizen.
Right.
So how to then, so that means that the peace agreement was based on certain kind of exclusionary history to some extent that recognizes people in certain way as they were at that moment of the war, as if they were Serbs, Croats, Muslims. I would say that many of them became that during and after the war and not before the war. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And the second thing,
Yeah.
then you can.
Yeah.
The second thing is this kind of a slippage in one sentence from Bosnia to Syria. And it makes me very uncomfortable. I know there are lessons, we can learn lessons, but these are very different places. And many Bosnians that you would talk about today, I'm disclosing my accent right here, would say, please do not use lessons from Bosnia and apply them to Syria. This is a very slippery slope. So I understand how in policy you have to think about these comparisons, there's history there, but also what are the dangers of this kind of thinking? I would like you to tell us, where is the line? Because I heard a lot about these are the lessons we should use. What about the ones we shouldn't? So
I want to be careful that you understand that using the word, history isn't some big brick or rock that kind of sits on something and, you got to work around it or, if you want to move it, that's, another effort. But history is something that it teaches you patterns. It's more about patterns than about dates and even people. I mean, if you look at European history, there's some people who don't exist anymore. Ruthenians, So history is a very kind of movable feast, if you will. I'm simply saying that you have to kind of understand where things have come from if you're going to say where they should be in the future. If you look at some of the worst dictators, Stalin, even Tito, although he wasn't the worst, they understood these nationality questions. And the reason is they understood the history of where some of these nationality questions came. If your point is that in Bosnia there has been a kind of putting people into this, you said these ethnic boxes, and I kind of agree with you there. Part of that was the fact that this war had gone on, and these ethnic identities had kind of become much stronger, and the hope was that they would release their grip on people in the as people began to live together. So, I know there are many Bosniaks who say, well, we never had a concept of Muslim. You Americans are always calling us Muslims. We're just Bosnians. And I think that's true for a lot of people living in Sarajevo. I'm not sure that's true for many others. And when you looked at Izetbegović's party, they were Bosnian Muslims. Now, occasionally he would do the same thing Milosevic would do. I'm sorry to put it that way. I don't mean to compare the two men. But he would say, look, I have a Croat in my delegation. So how dare you think of us as Bosnian Muslims? I have this Croat. Well, and Milosevic, I always remember I'd go up and talk to him, during the Kosovo conflict. He said, you're always talking about the Albanians. You mean Rugova Albanians. I have an Albanian. Mehmet, you're Albanian, right? Tell Ambassador Hill that you're Albanian. Albanian. Okay. It's pretty pathetic. He was trying to claim that he had this, that he was not pressing for kind of Serb domination of Kosovo. He was. And so I think you have to confront it more honestly than some people want to look at it. And I'm not suggesting that it's immutable. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't change. There are countries where ethnic identity has really gone away and people really don't care anymore. And that's what I think we all ought to strive for. But I don't think we should be so, when you have 30-something% of the population, Bosnian Serbs, feeling very strongly and feeling their identity was being crushed in the creation of something that hadn't been there before, an independent Bosnia. They felt their identity would be crushed when they are going to be the minority in an independent Bosnia. So the trick was to try to make them feel that their rights, even as a minority, would be protected, those democratic rights. Now, I would like to see a situation where you had people on the Izetbegović party who believed in small government, and people in one of the Serb parties who believed in small government. They would get together and they would have issues-based politics and not ethnic-based. Hallelujah, that's what we're looking for. But I don't think we can just whistle past the graveyard and assume that none of this has happened. A lot of bad stuff has happened. And I know there are people in Bosnia who said, how can you, great powers who tormented us in the past, be now presuming to tell us what we can do? And the answer is, when you've killed 230,000 people, you've kind of lost the right to complain about being patronized to. You're going to get a certain amount of, you can't go to the U.S. and be demanding airstrikes every day, which is what people like Satcher Bey and others were doing, and then not accept our concepts for peace. Work with us, say this won't work, you got to do something else, fine. But you can't just be asking for our airplanes and bombs without understanding that we need airplanes and bombs to be in the context of finding political solutions. Painful stuff, I know, I can tell. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Let me ask some more questions. Yes? Yes.
Yes, my question involves negotiating over nuclear. My question involves negotiating over nuclear capability. I think you've had some experience in this area now.
Yeah.
I guess the specific question is, should I feel confident about the result of the negotiations with Iran and the result and the future. that
Yeah,
we
I
can
mean,
look
it's a
at.
kind of a different question on the Bosnia. Unfortunately, no one in Bosnia had nuclear weapons, but, you know, to paraphrase Tina Turner, I mean, what's trust got to do with it? It's really all about, can you come up with systems where you can verify? And remember the famous Ronald Reagan line, absolutely the correct, you know, sure, we can trust, but let's verify. And so the real question of these nuclear deals is, can you verify them? You cannot, people who say you can do this entirely from so-called national technical means, you know, satellite pictures, you need people on the ground. And when you have people on the ground, you can do lots of things that you cannot do if you don't have people on the ground. So sometimes it's worth getting people on the ground, even if it sounds like you've made a concession to get them on the ground, because you know that you have technical abilities that you can deploy on the ground that maybe the other guy doesn't know you have those technical capabilities. So I think there's a lot to be said for nuclear deals that are robust in terms of getting people on the ground. And my sense is that that's what we've done with Iran. But I think the Iran deal is about nuclear weapons the way Moby Dick is a book about a whale. I mean, there's a lot more going on there. And starting with the fact that you know, when I'm in Rhode Island, I think of these old things. But starting with the fact that when the Saudis look at this deal, they are not worried about, they're not thinking about how many centrifuges did you allow the Iranians to keep. What they're thinking is this is back to the future, and you are starting this dance with your old buddy, the Iranians, and you've somehow given up on us, and you're going back to the Iranians. And so from this, and there's a lot of conspiracy in that part of the world, when you invade Iraq and turn it into in their view, a kind of Iranian friend, if not even client state, Shia, from the Saudi point of view, we are somehow supporting the Iranians. So we have to kind of make sure that the Saudis understand that we're not. And I think sometimes in providing those assurances, the first thing you do is the old-fashioned deal, which is you give them a big airplane deal. And you say, here's some F-18s and whatever you want. You know, you can have more, have to pay for them. But so that was part of the deal to try to mollify the Saudis. But we're doing some other things, such as looking the other way in Yemen, while the Saudis are busy in Yemen and are not busy in ISIS. And Ash Carter said the other day, well, you know, they've been distracted. The problem is that many Sunni Arabs, unfortunately, look at ISIS and they say, terrible means, we don't like them, we condemn what they're doing, but they have a point. And it's that last part that is really, we need to really work very hard on some of those Sunni Arabs to make them understand that there is no point. We need to defeat ISIS.
Were the Muslims in Bosnia Sunni or Shia?
They're Sunni, because most Muslims are Sunni. But you know, the Serbs are always saying, oh, these Muslims, you have to be careful with these Muslims. I mean, the Serbs, you know, made Donald Trump sound reasonable. And so, in fact, there was very little radicalism among Bosnian Muslims, very little. At the time, it was almost non-existent. I mean, it's there today, as it is in a lot of places, but it was non-existent in those days. Peter.
Thank you for that talk. I would describe it as pretty eloquent, passionate defense of Dayton. I hope you think that's fair. The question is...
Compared to what?
Right. As pragmatic as well. The question is, looking back on it, do you have any regrets? Are there things you would have done differently? You know, can you elaborate? Because basically, I felt it was a extremely well done defense. But if you could also look at the other side and say, well, what could be done differently?
You know, we set up a sort of arbitration mechanism for a couple of issues. You know, we were looking to help the Muslims with compactness in the Federation area. We we were, in retrospect, much more concerned about the so-called inter-entity boundary line than in the fullness of time we probably needed to be. So we were very concerned about compactness. And the consequence was, of course, Izetbegovic was very concerned about cities, towns in eastern Bosnia in which the Serbs had simply thrown the Muslims out. And so we were more sympathetic to trying to get compactness between the Federation and the Serbs so they would feel comfortable where they were. In the fullness of time, probably we were excessively concerned about that, and I think we should have maybe looked at it a little more the way Izetbegovic looked at it, which was towns, and to see whether towns could be recovered as, even though they'd be enclaves again. And remember, no one wanted to hear about enclaves then. But today, I think, Izetbegovic drew the line on Birchko. But he also wanted to draw the line on some of these other places, and he got pressured from the Europeans and even from us. So I think that could probably have been done differently. Secondly, I think the use of an arbitrator earlier in the Federation, later in the Birchko issue, where Robert Zoen often kind of kicked the can down the road, and which is probably the right approach. Maybe we should have built in more arbitration mechanisms so that, our point was, you want to change, you convince that other guy to have a change. And if he doesn't want the change, maybe you can trade something and get the change. So it was a bit of tough love. I mean, don't come to us asking us to jam the other guy. You've got to convince the other guy. We probably could have put in some more arbitration elements to prevent sort of obstructionists who were mainly and continue to be mainly the Bosnian Serbs, people like Dodik, et cetera. We probably could have done more there. One thing I thought was going to be a disaster was we didn't have a unitary army. And I thought that was going to be terrible. But actually, we've got more or less a unitary army. There's one army for Bosnia. So I guess we don't need a do-over on that, but I was really worried about it. It was particularly annoying then. First of all, to understand Dayton, and this, I think Holbrook gets a little of this in his book, but described a little of this in his book, is how thoroughly exhausted you are. It's not just 21 days, it's 21 days and nights. It's all the time. It's meetings at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's meetings at 5:30 following the meeting at 4 o'clock. So you're constantly, just constantly exhausted. And so you're also getting pretty grumpy about the idea of more war. The idea that someone would threaten someone with a weapon, you just want to shoot them right there. You just got so sick of it. And so then we had these Americans go to the Bosnian side, Americans acting as on their own, such as the guy who later became Rumsfeld's policy #3 guy in the Defense Department, Doug Feith. So I find this American over there telling the Bosnians to reject the deal until we gave them more M60 tanks. And I just found, in my life, the idea of negotiating against the United States government, I still don't get it. But that kind of stuff was going on. So we really, really wanted a situation where we didn't have more arms there. Yes, sir, and then I'll go over there. Yeah. Yes. Oh, Brian, how are you? We got to talk about the Celtics, but we'll do that later. All right. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Ambassador. So I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Bibi, Richard Holbrook's granddaughter.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. We were together in Telluride.
Yes, yes. If I make a personal plug before my question, if you haven't checked it out already, you should see the film that I made with my father, David Holbrook, The Diplomat. Ambassador Hill is a wonderful star of that. It is on HBO, and you can also pirate it, but that's more for the young crowd.
How do you get it if you don't get HBO? Because I don't get HBO.
Yeah, for now it's you just need to get your friend's account. But but soon enough we'll have DVDs and
So
it'll
it
be
will
available.
come out on DVD?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah. But my question ties into the last one, and that's I was under the impression that Dayton was meant more to be a transitional document, make some peace,
Yeah.
revisit it in
Yeah.
5 years, and now criticisms of it 20 years later are well-founded, but
None of us talked about it being a transitional document because if you call something a transitional document, people say it's only temporary and they won't respect it. So the idea was, this is it, guys, and if you want to change it, you can change it, but you have to do it by mutual consent. So it was open architecture, but we weren't advertising that, you can have your own constitution at some point in the future. We didn't want to make that as the advertisement because people would not respect it. And remember, we were putting troops in there. And when we put troops in there, we didn't want any sense, well, this is just something temporary, we can build something over on this side of the inter-entity boundary line, or we can ignore this or that. We just want to say, this is the law. So, but you're right. When we sat, when I would sit with Dick, we never dreamed that this thing would even be talked about in 20 years. We knew it was important for the reasons I mentioned. We dealt with this U.S.-European problem. We overcame these difficulties. We stopped a miserable war. We found a place for human rights in modern statecraft. We were proud of what we did, but we sure didn't think it was going to be around for 20 years. We thought the Bosnians would come up with something that they were much more comfortable with and which was homegrown and not foreign-grown. But they have to do that. And for them to be blaming us for the fact that they haven't done that, well, I go back to being very tired and grouchy, so. Oh. Yes.
Ambassador Hill, I'm asking a question. We have an overflow room upstairs, and this is a question from upstairs. I appreciate the response offered to Julian both the Guardian journalist and the critique of hindsight. But the question, was there anything in your engagement with Milosevic and the decision to exclude Kosovars from Dayton that caused you to worry about how the power dividend that Dayton gave him might lead to further bloodshed and a renewed effort by Serbian forces at ethnic cleansing in Kosovo in 1999?
When Peter asked what do-overs would you want, I didn't mention including Kosovo because I think it was really would not have been doable in the time frame that we were thinking of. And but after the initialing of Dayton, Holbrooke sent a couple of us to see Milosevic to make sure he was still on board, and we'd go to Paris in 3 weeks and he'd sign the Dayton documents. And Holbrooke was concerned about he'd get back to Serbia, there'd be all this upset, and then Milosevic would have a reason for not coming to Paris for the signing. So he sent us there. And so I took a walk with Milosevic at night around this big, it was up in Vojvodina, in one of those old Tito estates that he had. And so I took a walk around this big lake, and I had spent a lot of time in Kosovo, and I had been, I had opened up our embassy in Albania, so I was kind of very aware of these Albanian issues. And so I took this walk around with Milosevic, and I said to him, the mood was very positive, and I said, by a complete accident of history, words to that effect, you have been made a peacemaker. And I wanted to say, who'd have thunk that one? But, you, Milosevic, have become known as someone who supported a peace process and whose support was necessary to achieve that peace process. So you have this completely different perspective. I was sort of talking as a PR type person. I said, so you have this completely different landscape to look at. And so my question is, you know that this Kosovo issue is out there, and because during the Dayton Peace Accords we had people who came to the gate, and Milosevic asked Holbrooke that he not allow me to go talk to them. And so Holbrooke had agreed. He said, okay, I won't have Chris go there. I think they sent Rudy, who was our charge, Rudy Pirina, who was our charge in Belgrade, who handled Kosovo, and he had him go. But so I posed this to Milosevic, what are you going to do with this opportunity? And I'm sorry to say his answer was just really mundane. I mean, he just said, look, we've given them this education deal. They won't take it. The education deal was essentially with lots of strings attached that would make, if you went to these, remember the Albanians were boycotting the schools in Kosovo. And so there's no way the Albanians could accept that deal. And that was his only answer. And I pushed him further, and I didn't get anywhere. So it was Milosevic was not prepared to deal at that point.
I wanted to offer an observation from the bottom of the food chain as a brigade commander in Bosnia for a year. I thought, I hear a lot of there's no substitute for victory, and so I did appreciate your spirited, apparently misguided defense of Dayton, but I do appreciate it because as a guy who had to implement it, all I can say is every day that we were there, I would tell my soldiers, 500 people didn't die a day. I don't know what victory looks like in Bosnia, and I don't think they do. Parenthetically, quick anecdote, having lunch with my friends from the 21st Bosnian Infantry Division, 2nd Bosnia Corps, all Bosniaks. And they wanted to tell me about the awful Chetniks. They didn't want to talk about Adustasha, and they didn't want to talk about the 7th SS Mountain Division, raised entirely of Bosniaks, as they now call themselves, and Croats. Everybody talks about 100,000 German troops tied down in the Balkans.
Yeah.
There were 100,000 troops from Yugoslavia, mostly Bosnian and Croat, tied down, and they were the guys tied down. So when we were selective about our history, the Serbs want to tell you about Kosovo Polje and who shot their uncle. Everyone's got a story, and there is no substitute for victory except when there's no alternative.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for your defense of that miserable treaty.
Thanks very much for your comments. Brian.
Chris, thanks so much for the way you've kicked off this discussion about Dayton plus 20. I'm delighted that your history teacher is here as well, because I recall a discussion we had in Macedonia about the myths of history.
Yeah.
3,000 years ago, this village attacked this village, or this ethnic group did this to what. So, I mean, you've become balkanized. I mean, despite the wonderful career you've had dealing with the North Koreans and everything else, it seems to me there isn't a diplomat around that knows as much about the Balkans as you do.
Don't forget my dealings with the tenured faculty, too.
Hey,
Couldn't resist, guys. All right. Yeah.
I've been there. They say you can negotiate with terrorists, but not tenured faculty. All right, sorry about that. I wanted to ask you about one institution you didn't mention, which you created, which was supposed to be transitional, and that's the High Representative, the Office of the High Representative, because, I mean, that became a very, very important aspect of actually implementing the agreement.
Yeah.
And think about the roles of people like Carl Bildt and Patty Ashdown in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that was the creation of the High Rep. Well, first of all, the Europeans were going to pay for a lot of what we were doing in Bosnia. They were going to pay for the implementation. And so at Dayton, it was decided, and I think appropriately so, that the Europeans would take the lead by having the position of the High Rep, with one of the deputies being American. So the first High Rep was Carl Bildt, who had been Swedish Prime Minister and had been the kind of lead European Union negotiator through the spring and the summer of 1995. And one of his deputies was an American named Jacobi. And but the real problem with the High Rep was not just whether the person should be American or European Union. The issue was, or the concept was, that the High Rep would essentially adjudicate issues in Bosnia, but adjudicate in the sense of what is a Dayton principle and what is not. And so it was an effort. It did not really adjudicate questions departing from Dayton, which is what I was talking about earlier, that if we had some kind of arbitrator who could get us away from some of the Dayton things that might not be working, but we would be able to do it in a way that both sides would accept that arbitration. It was more to adjudicate things that said, you know, that's Dayton, that's not Dayton. And I must tell you, I think it went on, it's gone on a lot longer than I thought it would, than I thought it should, really. And I think to some extent, it helped create a sort of complaining society that didn't take responsibility because there was, you know, Patty Ashdown or Carl or someone else. And so I would have liked to see a sunset provision of it. And we probably should have done that in terms of, you know, going back to the woulda, shoulda, coulda list. Because I think the problem historically for Bosnia, often or always a sub-sovereign, was the idea that someone else was responsible for fixing problems. And I think that kind of message of tough love needs to be really inculcated, that they need to fix them, and they need to fix them on the basis of some peaceful process.
One last question? Okay, well, I think we have the opportunity to continue the discussion with a reception out in the lobby. So on behalf of the Watson Institute, I'd like to thank Christopher Miller.
Thank you. Anyway, Sue, I got to give Sue Eckert, I want to thank for working so hard on this project. And I guess tomorrow we'll have more time to go over this. But I really think there are a lot of lessons in Dayton, as I tried to point out, that we really need to relearn. So thank you.